So, who wants to kind of describe what came out of their discussion? It's like, well, this group. Let me start. Who's going to be the spokesperson today? Go ahead.
Let's see here. So for some common challenges, we hit on things like the format of the interview. Quite often will be different, and then from there we kind of went into, there's a whole bunch of different formats, whether it's a phone interview or a video interview.
Yes.
The type of questions.
Yes.
And then when you get into the interview, reading the body language.
Yes.
And especially behavioral or situational questions, understanding what's appropriate in the Canadian context.
Yes.
And how to translate your experience there, as well as cultural differences about how you're supposed to act in the interview and that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So this group, do you want to add to this? Or be more specific, because I guess, like, do you want to give some specific examples?
We had a lot of similar conversation. I think you mentioned asking good questions, not just responding to questions.
Yes, that is an important element, yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned formality, like what we meant by that is some foreign trained professionals or IEPs, they'll expect it to be a very formal process, and when the interviewer introduces themselves as like John Smith, they're unprepared for referring to them on a first name basis with that level of informality.
Yes.
Panel interview, I've had clients be surprised where it was like 3 people interviewing them.
Yeah.
Length of responses they give.
That's a big one.
Depending on where you're from, you want to lay down the background and the foundation to tell your story, whereas kind of they expect you to get to the point fairly succinctly. Speaking patterns. So I can't recall your model, but you have this thing where it's like Canadians will typically wait right till the end of when you speak and then start responding.
Yeah.
Often there'll be a pause for some, and so the Canadian interviewer is sitting there going, okay, why aren't you answering me? Why are you always pausing?
Yeah.
But they're showing you respect, right?
So, yeah, it is how much silence should there be in a conversation?
Yeah, that's a good way to summarize it.
Like, because in some culture you will end up with much longer silences.
Yeah.
In like East Asian cultures, generally speaking. Also First Nations in the prairies.
Yeah.
If you work with like elders, for example. But on the flip side, you have people like people in Latin cultures who will start speaking as soon as they think they understand where the person is going. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, so one group will be perceived as very slow by Canadians, the other one will be perceived as rude. Either way, it really leads to a very negative evaluation. And where it really creates the biggest challenge is on the phone. Because if somebody, like a recruiter, asks a question and then you end up with a long silence after that, if you're in person, you can see the person's gears are turning, they are thinking. But if you're on the phone, all you get is dead air. Yeah. And that really gets people very stressed. Yeah?
I think we had one more. Feel free to add if I forgot anything. Language, but specifically, Canadian sort of idioms or sayings. Mm-hmm. I've had clients come to me asking what these things meant, and I had to explain. This is a common saying, the example I thought of, let's hit the ground running.
Yes.
What does that mean? What are they talking about?
Yes.
So I don't know if you have anything to add. But.
Go ahead.
I'll add something on the asking questions part, because I think another challenge is being able to keep track of the conversation and be able to adapt. Because if someone goes into the interview with 3 questions, they're hell-bent on going to ask those 3 questions. But maybe during the interviewer has already spoken to that point.
Yes.
And then because I have to ask these questions, I'm going to ask these questions, but they've already been, spoken to at length during the interview.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important that people listen, and if their questions are addressed, then think of how you can, maybe twist them or
ask a new one or go in more depth. Yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah. So I think we all agree that there's lots of ways people can lose in jobs during the interviews. Again, there's so many little things that can create challenges. So, as you were on the phone, one big challenge is people will quite often at home will be speaking their first language. So I can get the phone call. At that point, they have to switch channel and go into English. And the challenge is it's not instantaneous. So the beginning of the conversation can be a challenge. I really encourage people to like listen to the radio for like 30 minutes before doing a telephone interview, if they know that this is what's going to the time at which the interview will be. Sometimes people call out of the blue. Obviously, you can't do that. But if it is a scheduled telephone interview, listen to the radio, like CBC, for 30 minutes before the interview, as a way to getting yourself prepped for language patterns and stuff like that. Yeah. One big thing during telephone interviews: smile. And I don't know if you've heard of that. Like, people say, put a mirror in front of you and smile to yourself. I know that sounds very strange, okay? But it is true that if people will, I'm not saying people will hear your smile, but your tone of voice will become more friendly. Okay? I know that some organizations will ask you to start with a video interview. Like, you have, and you only get 3 chances. Meaning, like, you record yourself once, you can delete. You can record yourself a second time, you can delete. You can record yourself a third time, but you cannot delete that one. You will have to keep, like, they only give you 3 chances. So that part can be a huge challenge for people who are not used to it. And this is, again, one of these situations where practice makes a lot of difference. So one piece of advice I give to everybody is videotape yourself when you prepare for interviews. Has any of you done that?
Yeah.
What happens? How does it feel?
It feels really weird.
Yeah.
But you end up gaining your confidence.
So it does feel very weird at the beginning. It feels awful. I mean, I know for myself, like, I always think of myself as a good public speaker, and then I watch myself on film, and it's like, oh my God, I got all these mannerisms that are terrible. You know? So I find it's very scary to videotape yourself, but I really encourage everybody, because that's how you see how people see you, as opposed to how you think you come across.
And how you sound as well.
Yes.
Because I remember I always have an issue with how my own voice sounds on the phone.
Yes.
Or on a video.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when we hear ourselves, we really hear the sound go from our mouth to the ears, but through the head, not through the outside. So it ends up being a different sound. You know? Yeah. So the one fundamental thing is practice. Okay? Practice in particular. So to me, this thing is the way I encourage people to use the accomplishment statement is write down write down the answer to, let's say, the 30 most common interview questions, and use those examples. Try to come up with at least 2 examples per question. Why I say that? Because you may have used that example to answer another question before. So you need a backup one. Otherwise, like, if you tell twice the same story, it really doesn't work. Goes back to your point, Onai, about keeping track of the conversation. If you keep using the same story to answer any question, that's not going to work. They'll think, well, that's the only thing you did well. Again, so you need a range of stories. And writing these stories down is really critical. So I'll come back to your point that Javier was making about essentially giving too much background information, or not giving the information in the right order. So why do people do that? Well, in most of the rest of the world, most of the countries immigrants come from, you cannot understand me if you don't understand where I come from. So people will give a lot of background information in order for people to feel, for them to feel like their counterpart will understand the context. The trouble is, this is an environment where people give less context, and so as a result, people will give information that recruiters will consider as useless. And it delays the point at which they start to get into what the recruiters are thinking of interesting. It usually starts right off the bat. Because when people ask Because what's the first question you get in virtually all Canadian interviews? Tell me about yourself. And what do people answer to that question? Well, there's many parts of the world where in order for you to understand who I am, you need to understand who my family is. So people will start with, my grandfather was an engineer, my father was an engineer, my uncle was an engineer, my big brother is an engineer. It's like, I am an engineer. Well, yeah, but by that point, you've already lost people. So just to give you an example, has any of you seen a movie called Midnight's Children? If you have a chance to watch it, it's actually a good movie. So Midnight's Children is a movie that talks about the kind of the history of India since independence. Remember we said yesterday, India became independent in 1947. When do you think the movie starts? It talks about India from 1947 onwards. When does the movie start? Well, if it was a Canadian movie, you probably would start in 1945 or 1946. But it's an Indian movie, so it starts in 1910. It starts with the grandfather of the main character. You cannot understand that character without understanding where he comes from. And that's exactly what happens. When answering the question, tell me about yourself, people will give a whole pile of information usually that recruiters do not consider as relevant or useful or applicable. And so as a result, they tune out. And unfortunately, that was the first question. And so if they tune out at the first question, well, that's it. You've lost the job. I mean, I've seen so many people lose the job because how long do people take to make their judgment during a job interview? Do you know?
Pretty fast.
It is very quick. Okay? Like I remember Manpower saying that most recruiters will make the decision kind of this is the right candidate or not in the first 7 minutes.
Right.
My personal experience is like they usually do it in 2 minutes, like not even seven. Because a lot of it is based on first impression. Mm-hmm. A lot of it is, fundamentally we go back to that question about, does the conversation flow? Does it feel comfortable? Do I feel like I want to work with that person? Mm-hmm. So, as you were saying, I mean, I overheard the conversation. Smiling. That is another part of the body language that is really important in Canada. Remember we said yesterday, like you gotta smile. No matter how much life sucks, you have to smile. Another one is chit chat. So if you think of the typical process of an interview, like in many organizations, you know, the candidate will go to the reception area and you talk to the receptionist, that person tells you to sit down and wait, and then somebody comes to pick you up at the reception area, walks you to a meeting room, and the interview will start in the meeting room. But before then, what will happen? Well, number one, the candidate will greet the person, who usually somebody from HR for the first interview. Okay? Do I shake hands or not? That is already a big challenge. Do I look at the person in the eyes or not? That's another one. And then while people are walking to the room, what very often happens is they will chit-chat. So the challenge there will be, is the chit-chat topic that the candidate is trying to use to kind of broach the conversation considered appropriate in a Canadian context? So what are the typical chit-chat topics in Canada? The weather is the biggest one. Okay? Sports, okay, and traffic is another one. Like these tend to be the top three. But in other parts of the world, so the weather, there's many parts of the world, like if you're in Nigeria, what's the point? Why would you discuss the weather? It's the same every day. Right? What's the weather forecast for Nigeria today? It's going to be hot, hazy, and humid. It will rain at 6 p.m. And that happens 665 days of the year. So how much time do they discuss the weather? Nothing. Like, what's the point? What will be a good topic of conversation in Nigeria? Chit-chat topic. Politics. Okay. And family. So typical questions I've received from people: are you married? Do you have kids? Where are you in the sibling order? You know, like how many siblings do you have, and are you the firstborn? Like, where are you? These questions, you try to chit-chat with somebody in Canada using questions like these, that will get you immediately out. And the other one, politics, is common in many parts of the world. Like, well, but if you try to discuss politics in Canada, what happens? Again, that is one of the fastest ways to get rejected as a candidate. In Hong Kong, does any of you know what's the number one subject for chit-chat in Hong Kong? Money. People will discuss the currency market, the stock market, and the real estate market all the time. If you go to Hong Kong, quite often you have Business News Network in the sports bar. Well, in the bars. Like, not sports, because they don't discuss sports. They discuss money. I mean, my wife has was one good friend in Hong Kong. Like, this is the one place where the whole dinner conversation can be about markets. Okay? Like, no sports, no politics, markets. Okay? So a good chit-chat or common chit-chat questions in Hong Kong will be, how much did you pay for your purse? How much do you pay for your rent? I mean, these are very common questions. Well, that doesn't work here. So you see how people can lose jobs in the first 2 minutes. Like, if I don't shake hands. Okay. Now, let's come to that question, because that is one topic that usually comes up. Yes?
Sorry, I have a question. When chit-chatting about Canadian weather,
Yeah.
As a newcomer, you're chit-chatting, but you're not complaining, right? You know what
No,
I mean?
you can complain about the weather.
Okay,
That is
okay.
totally fine. The weather is always bad in Canada. That is the one thing you can complain about endlessly. Okay? I mean, it was really striking. I remember being like, this was a number of years ago, but in Toronto, there was a period of time when it was in January, and the weather was, well, I considered good, because the temperature was positive during the day. You know, it was like somewhere between +5 and +10, several days in a row. And Canadians call that weird. Like, they didn't say it was good, they said it was weird. Okay? The weird already means, this is not right, this is negative. Okay? To me, it's like, yeah! It's like, we don't need jackets. So the weather's always bad. That's the one thing you can complain about endlessly. Okay? Other things, yeah, you got to be careful. So, shaking hands. This is a big topic. Okay? You don't have to shake hands. That's an important point. But how you turn down the greeting makes a world of difference in my experience. I've seen people essentially behave like, well, you should know I'm not going to shake hands with you. What implicit message does that behavior communicate? Anyone?
I don't like you and I don't want to engage with you.
That's what people will receive. And one big thing is, it will be received as, you need to adapt to me. And I haven't hired you yet, and you're asking me to adapt to you. What is it going to be like if I hire you? So that is a really quick way to make sure you lose the job. So how do you do it? I've seen people do this. Like, you can put your hand on your heart and do kind of a little bow or whatever it is. But the key message you need to communicate is, I understand this is your expectation. I'm the outsider. I'm not going to do that, but I understand that this is your expectation, and and it's normal. Okay? And I will adapt to you, not the other way around. Is everybody with me on this? Because that makes a world of difference. If the people on the recruiting side feel like the candidate is sending the implicit message, you need to adapt to me, I mean, the odds of you getting the jobs are really low at that point. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah?
So can I?
Please, go ahead.
So one thing that's come up for me as career advisors, cross-gender handshaking for certain religions.
Yes, exactly.
So the best advice I've heard from recruiters is just say the reason why I'm not shaking your hand. Just be direct but honest about it, and usually it's totally acceptable.
Yeah.
in my experience. So I used to present on like, oh, have a confident handshake and you must do that, but I've kind of rolled that advice back because I don't think it's correct.
Well, yeah. So I've told people, like, you put your hand on your heart and you do a little bow and you say, I'm sorry, I won't shake your hands for religious reasons.
Exactly.
Okay? But you make it clear, your tone of voice, again, will be very important.
Yeah.
Okay? You make it clear that you're the outsider and you're adapting to them as opposed to the other. Well, you're finding a compromise.
Yeah.
And you're the initiator of that compromise. Okay? Because that's, if you, like, I've seen people behave essentially in ways like, you have to adapt to me. And that's not going to work. Okay? The other thing I recommend is, if you're not going to shake hands with women, like as a man, you probably don't want to shake hands with men as well, because like if you do it to one versus the other, it can create a lot of issues.
Yeah.
Okay? It will be perceived as, well, if you're not going to work with women the way you work with men, that is going to create a huge issue in the organization, and that's a big deal. Okay? What else happened during? Yes.
I have a question, because you say from the side of the employee, you are saying what you should do. I should shake hand, but how about if they don't want to shake hand? For example, in my country, the person that you are receiving me will shake. You will give the hands first.
That's
and
right.
Here,
Most of the time in Canada, people will extend their hands to shake yours. I mean, it's really rare.
because they can have religions.
Absolutely.
This is a country of religion.
It can happen, but the odds of that happening are very low, in my experience. Because when you are inside the organization, it means, well, unless you happen to interview for I don't know, like a mosque or something like that, for a job in a mosque, the odds of the person not extending their hands to shake yours are really low, in my experience. So obviously you have to adapt. Okay, I mean, I've seen situations where I've worked with candidates, like female candidates, who said, "Well, I'm not going to shake your hands for religious reasons." That's totally fine. I understand. Okay. Well, I remember yesterday I was talking about this lady from Qatar who sent me a really nice LinkedIn invitation. Okay, we talked, and it's like, at the end, my first reaction was I was going to hug her. Okay, and then I realized that's probably not a good idea. Okay, and like we kind of, we didn't touch, obviously, but it was very clear that I wanted to communicate a positive feeling towards her. Same thing in reverse. We just have to find a different way of doing it. Okay, the intent is really. The intent and how you communicate that intent is really critical at that point, in my experience. Okay. So what else can go wrong? So the amount of silence, how much emotion people will display, those will come into play. Yes, asking questions. There's so many things in my experience that can go wrong. So big one is describing what I did, but not quantifying, not giving people a sense that how good a job you've done, or downplaying it. A big one, I'm sure you've all seen it, is we did this, talking about the team. So why is that? So we'll come back to that point. That one, in my experience, has a huge impact, both during the interview, but also afterwards in teamwork. And this is a big one, because most, actually I cannot think of anybody yet who has identified that teamwork is important around the world. That is a constant. But what people do not realize in most cases is that being a good team player means different things in different parts of the world. And so as a result, many immigrants will operate in a way that will make them a good team player back home, but it doesn't work here. So we'll come back to what that means and why. So communication style differences, yes. And one big one, again, this is the accomplishment template, is preparing your stories, writing them down. One big thing is it will enable you to make sure you have the right vocabulary. You're using the words that people would use here. It makes a big difference in my experience, because what emotional state are we in during a job interview?
lot of stress.
Yes, we're very stressed. So what happens when we're very stressed? We forget, exactly. When we are stressed, we revert to our default behaviors. Default from a cultural perspective, default from a personality perspective, default from a language perspective. So our ability, for example, to find words will go down when we are stressed. And so writing it down is really important because this way the words will be top of mind. I can't remember if I mentioned this example yesterday or not. So my wife has it's a third time removed cousin or something like that in Toronto. So this guy, he has a PhD in some field like microbiology or something like that. Hang on a second. Do you want to close the door because I'm just hearing the background noise? So he has a PhD in something like microbiology, and he works for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And he gets up at 4 a.m. every day to go inspect slaughterhouses before they start, the work of killing animals and processing them. And he'd like to have a job in an office, as opposed to having to get up every morning at 4 a.m. So he's gone, it's been several years, he's gone through, he has to go through the internal process to do that. It's it is exactly like an internal recruitment process. And so they have written exams. Written exams, he aces them every single time. Where he fails pretty much every single time is interviews, because his English is not good. He's Chinese. I mean, his English is not that great. And so I remember when I met him the first time, I told him, well, you should write down your answers. And he told me, well, that's going to take a lot of time. Yes, but how long have you been applying? 5 years. Okay? So in 5 years, I'm sure you would have been able to write it. Okay? So the idea is this is where the long-term versus short-term comes in. People are driven and dedicated. If you really want that job, you need to write down your answers. It will make a world of difference. So providing too much information is a very common one. Another one I see quite often is people provide information in a different order. Like if you think of the story that people are used to tell, the title, situation, problem, action, results. I've had a number of people present it essentially like problem, action, results, and then title and situation. It's the same information, but it's not in the order people are used to process it. And they can't process it. Because if I'm waiting for a title and I get something else, I cannot move. It's very much like a computer that's asking for a number and the user gives it a letter or a word. The computer will just keep asking you for that number, and it will not go anywhere until you've given it a number. Well, I find our brains function almost like that when it comes to this. If you don't tell people stories the way they used to hear those stories, they cannot process the information, even if you're giving them the exact same information. Is everybody with me on this point? Okay, so I mean, this is very much what you were saying, Javier. When you were saying they give the information in a different order, and it is not processed. That's exactly it. Okay? So 2 other very common comments. I'm sure you've heard.
Can I ask one question?
Please.
Communication style.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want me using the mic.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Sorry. Yes, I apologize. Go
I
ahead.
actually kind of wanted to ask everyone, for your clients in their industries, how important are acronyms? Because in accounting, it is absolutely critical that you know the glossary of terms for your industry. So if I say FP&A or M&A, You might not know what that is, but if you're in accounting, you need to know that's financial planning and analysis, management discussion and analysis, because they are going to drop these common acronyms on you in the interview, and they're not going to explain what that is. And it might be referred to as something different from your home country. So I'm just wondering, for you and your clients, do you have like a glossary of terms or something for them? Okay.
I mean, it comes back to language. Part of the language that is specific to each field is the acronyms that are specific to the field. Now, sometimes, if I take the example of engineering, some acronyms are frequently used in, well, mechanical engineering, not in chemical, and so on. And part of being part of the gang is knowing what those acronyms mean. Yeah. It is a big part of it, yes. I mean, definitely. So that's part of the preparation. Knowing, so how do you find all these words? Well, you talk to people in the field. Because remember we talked about networking and being active in a professional association. If you go to a meeting of the CPA Alberta, like one of the public meetings, like chapter meetings, networking events, it won't take long before people start using those acronyms with you.
Exactly.
And you'll quickly realize, I need to know what that means.
So we've created the list for them.
Oh.
I don't know if you, as counselors, have done that, but it's very, very helpful to do that.
Yeah. So 2 other comments that I'm sure you've all, or your clients have heard before. You're overqualified. You lack Canadian experience. So we're going to talk about what that means in a minute. Okay? Let me start with we. Because I'm sure you've all heard that one. You know, like the recruiter asks, what did you do, or something like that, and the person answers, we did this. What does we mean to the average Canadian recruiter? We means you didn't do anything. This is a big thing. Okay? We means the team did something, but you didn't do anything. And so this is a big deal.